The moment suspicion becomes evidence, power begins to collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a political analysis. This is a psychological autopsy of power itself. History repeatedly shows us something disturbing. Authoritarian systems rarely collapse because of external enemies first. They collapse because fear begins consuming the system from the inside. And the turning point is always the same. The moment suspicion replaces evidence, that is the moment reality begins to disappear. At first, the leader believes he is strengthening control. In reality, he is slowly destroying the very mechanisms that keep power alive. Trust, communication, competence, and truth. One of the clearest modern examples is the regime of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. Over the years, high-ranking military officers, intelligence officials, judges, and even longtime political allies were removed, arrested, exiled, or accused of conspiracy. Why? Because collapsing systems become terrified of witnesses. When economies fail, corruption spreads, and internal conflicts deepen. The greatest threat is no longer the opposition outside the palace. The greatest threat becomes the people inside the room, who know how the system truly works. Every dictator eventually discovers a terrifying psychological truth. The people most capable of destroying me are the people who once stood beside me. That fear changes everything. The military is no longer valued for competence. It is valued for obedience. Professional officers become dangerous because professional officers can organize resistance. So the regime weakens the military politically while making it economically dependent on the ruler. Under Maduro, loyalty increasingly mattered more than combat effectiveness. Military elites were purged after coup attempts. Economic privileges were handed to loyal factions. The armed forces became less of a national institution and more of a survival mechanism for the regime. And this creates a paradox. Strong militaries can threaten dictators. Weak militaries cannot defend nations. So authoritarian rulers often choose personal survival over national strength. The result is predictable. Internal distrust rises, command structures weaken, and state capacity slowly decays. But the most psychologically revealing stage comes later. Eventually, dictators begin eliminating old allies. Not because those allies are enemies, but because they remember too much. They remember the leader before power. They remember the compromises, the lies, the betrayals, the gap between revolutionary ideals and political reality. To ordinary citizens, an old comrade looks loyal. To a paranoid ruler, that same person becomes a living archive of dangerous truths. And this is where authoritarian systems begin, transforming into fear-driven machines. The process usually unfolds in 3 stages. Remove insiders to control information. Control the military and courts to monopolize force. Erase former allies to rewrite memory itself. At that point, the state no longer functions as an institution. It becomes an extension of one man's fear. And once fear becomes the operating system of power, something extraordinary happens inside organizations. Everyone begins watching everyone else. In authoritarian environments, survival depends on displaying loyalty before someone else accuses you first. Military officers secretly record colleagues. Government officials report political comments from co-workers. Journalists monitor other journalists to avoid collective punishment. The organization stops functioning as a cooperative system. It becomes an internal surveillance ecosystem. And when fear dominates institutions, responsibility disappears. Nobody wants to make decisions anymore. Because in systems ruled by paranoia, mistakes are not treated as errors. They are treated as betrayals. Military commanders delay action while waiting for higher instructions. Bureaucrats endlessly forward documents upward. Executives hold meetings instead of making decisions. Why? Because action creates risk. In healthy systems, competence is rewarded. In fearful systems, invisibility is rewarded. Eventually, truth itself becomes dangerous. And when truth becomes dangerous, people stop reporting reality. Battlefield losses are minimized. Economic data is manipulated. Public crises are hidden. Disasters are downplayed, not because everyone is evil, but because honesty becomes psychologically associated with punishment. This is the true tragedy of authoritarian power. The leader demands absolute control, but absolute control destroys honest information. And once a ruler loses access to reality, collapse becomes inevitable. The ancient spiritual text, Tibetan Book of the Dead, contains a haunting warning. Fear creates illusion, and illusion destroys the self. That is precisely what happens inside collapsing regimes. Surveillance comes from fear. Responsibility avoidance comes from self-preservation. Information suppression comes from refusing to face reality. Eventually, the ruler no longer governs the real world. He governs a hallucination created by terror, and history shows us the ending again and again. Power appears strongest right before it breaks. From the outside, authoritarian systems often look disciplined, united, and invincible. But internally, trust is already dead. Truth is already buried. Fear has already replaced reality. And the moment suspicion becomes evidence, that regime is already entering its final stage. Because power does not die when enemies attack it. Power dies when nobody inside the system dares to speak the truth anymore. And that leads us to the final question. Why do dictators eventually begin killing their own supporters? Because in the final stage of fear, even loyalty itself becomes suspicious. That is the subject of our next lecture. Why dictators eventually destroy their own allies. If you want to continue exploring the psychology of collapsing power, political paranoia, and the hidden mechanics of authoritarian systems, subscribe, share this video, and follow this series to the end.